Sometimes the loneliest seat in the room is the one with your name on it. Emily Carter read the small white card again, just to make sure she hadn't misunderstood it. Table 19. She looked across the wedding reception hall, past the polished dance floor and rows of glowing candles, until she spotted it near the back wall, beside a tall window. Almost every other table was filled with couples laughing, adjusting ties, or leaning close for quiet conversations. Emily let out a small breath and walked toward the table, her heels soft against the wooden floor. The wedding venue was beautiful in the kind of effortless way only expensive places manage to achieve. Strings of warm lights stretched across the ceiling like tiny constellations, and white roses decorated every table. The air smelled faintly like vanilla cake and fresh flowers. For a moment, Emily wondered if she should have stayed home instead. She had almost done exactly that earlier that afternoon, while standing in front of her apartment mirror, holding the one navy blue dress she owned that still looked formal enough for an event like this. Weddings were complicated when you were a single mom. Most invitations were addressed to couples, and most conversations eventually drifted toward husbands, mortgages, or vacation plans. Emily smoothed the fabric of her dress and sat down at the nearly empty table. She placed her small purse on her lap and glanced around the room. On the far side of the hall, the bride and groom were greeting guests, surrounded by people who looked polished and confident in a way Emily hadn't felt in years. She smiled politely when a waiter passed by and offered a tray of sparkling drinks. "Just water, please," she said gently. The truth was, she needed to drive home later. Her 6-year-old daughter Lily was staying with a neighbor tonight, and Emily never liked being too far away for too long. She reached for the water glass and took a quiet sip while watching the celebration unfold around her. Laughter echoed from nearby tables. Someone clinked a fork against a champagne glass. The room was full of joy, yet Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she had accidentally stepped into someone else's life for the evening. She checked her phone quickly out of habit and smiled when she saw the lock screen photo of Lily holding a crayon, drawing of the two of them under a bright yellow sun. "Hope the wedding has cake," Lily had said earlier before Emily left the apartment. Emily chuckled softly at the memory. She had promised to bring a slice home if she could. Just as she slipped the phone back into her purse, the empty chair beside her moved slightly. Someone had pulled it out and sat down. Emily looked up, expecting another quiet guest who had been assigned to the forgotten table near the window. Instead, she found herself facing a tall man in a dark tailored suit, probably late 30s, with calm gray eyes and the composed posture of someone used to being noticed in a room. For a few seconds he said nothing. He simply studied the celebration around them, then glanced at the place card in front of Emily. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low enough that no one else at the table could hear. "I know this might sound strange," he said quietly, leaning just slightly closer so only she could hear him over the music. "But if you pretend to be my wife tonight, I promise it will change your life." Emily blinked, certain she had misheard him. The music from the small live band drifted through the reception hall, while laughter rose from nearby tables. Yet the strange sentence he had just spoken seemed to quiet everything around her. She studied the man sitting beside her again, trying to decide if this was some kind of awkward joke. His suit looked expensive, the kind that fit too perfectly to be rented, and his calm expression suggested he was completely serious. Emily lowered her voice. "I am sorry, what did you just say?" The man gave a faint apologetic smile, as if he knew exactly how ridiculous it sounded. "I said that if you pretend to be my wife tonight, it will make both of our evenings a lot easier." Emily let out a short breath of disbelief. "You do realize we have never met before?" "That is true," he replied calmly. "But you also look like the only person in this room who does not want to be here." She almost laughed at that, because unfortunately he was not entirely wrong. Even if that were true, pretending to be your wife is a little extreme. The man nodded slightly, as though he respected the point. For a moment, he glanced across the room toward the front of the reception hall, where several elegantly dressed guests stood talking near the bride's family. When he looked back at Emily, his voice was even quieter. "In about 10 minutes, someone over there is going to come looking for me. If she finds me alone, tonight becomes very complicated." Emily followed his gaze without turning her head too obviously. "An ex-girlfriend?" she guessed. "Something like that," he said carefully. "A situation my family has been trying to arrange for months." Emily leaned back slightly in her chair, folding her hands around the stem of her water glass. So your solution is to ask a complete stranger to pretend she married you. The man shrugged with a calm honesty that caught her off guard. At the moment, it is the most practical option I have. She shook her head, amused and confused at the same time. You do not even know my name. Emily Carter, he said. Her eyebrows lifted in surprise. He pointed subtly to the place card sitting in front of her plate. I promise I am not psychic. She exhaled and rubbed her forehead lightly, half laughing now. And what exactly would pretending involve? Nothing complicated, he answered. Just sitting with me, walking into the reception together when people start gathering, and allowing everyone to believe we are married. No uncomfortable questions, no dramatic explanations. After the evening ends, we both go back to our normal lives. Emily stared at him for several seconds, waiting for the punchline that never came. This is the strangest conversation I have had all year, she admitted. I am aware of that, he said gently. But I would not ask if I did not truly need the help. She studied his face again, trying to read whether this man was reckless or simply desperate. The strange thing was that he did not look desperate at all. He looked composed, thoughtful, and oddly sincere. And why do you think I would agree to something like that? Emily asked. The man paused, considering his words carefully before answering. Because sometimes two strangers sitting at the same forgotten table might both need a small change in their night. Then he added softly, and because I would make sure the favor is worth your time. Emily looked down at the clear water in her glass, watching the reflections of the wedding lights ripple across the surface table while considering it. 2 or 3 hours. That was not long. But the idea of pretending to be married to a stranger in a room full of people still felt absurd. And what exactly do you expect me to do during those hours? She asked. Daniel gave a small, thoughtful shrug. Stand beside me when necessary. Smile when people greet us. Allow me to introduce you as my wife if the situation requires it. Emily raised an eyebrow. That sounds very official. Daniel smiled faintly. My family tends to ask many questions. She sighed quietly and looked across the reception hall again. The bride and groom had just entered the room to applause, and guests were beginning to stand. Emily thought briefly about her small apartment, about the laundry she had left folded on the couch, and about Lily probably watching cartoons at the neighbor's house. Life usually followed a simple pattern of work, home, and caring for her daughter. Nothing like this ever happened. When she looked back at Daniel, her curiosity had clearly replaced some of her hesitation. All right, she said slowly. Let us say for a moment that I consider helping you. What exactly makes it worth my time? Daniel reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket, then paused before pulling anything out. Instead, he met her eyes and spoke quietly. Enough to make sure tonight was not just another evening you wish you had skipped. Emily held his gaze for a second, then shook her head slightly with a faint smile. You are very confident, Daniel Whitmore. Not confident, he said calmly. Just honest about the situation. Then he added softly, and I have a feeling you might enjoy surprising everyone in this room. Emily let out a slow breath and leaned back slightly in her chair while the sound of applause spread through the reception hall as the bride and groom reached the center of the dance floor. Guests lifted their glasses and cameras flashed softly across the room. For a moment, Emily allowed the celebration to distract her from the strange conversation happening at the quiet table near the window. But Daniel Whitmore was still sitting beside her, watching her patiently as if he understood that she needed a moment to think. Emily turned her head back toward him and gave a small, uncertain smile. You know this is still a very strange offer. Daniel nodded calmly. I would be concerned if you did not think so. She studied his face again. There was something steady about him, something that made it difficult to believe he would create unnecessary drama at someone else's wedding. He seemed more like a man who preferred simple solutions. Emily folded her hands together on the table. If I agree to this, we need a few rules. Daniel's expression brightened slightly with relief. That sounds reasonable. First, Emily said carefully, this is only for tonight. When the reception ends, the arrangement ends. Agreed, Daniel replied immediately. Second, you do not ask me any personal questions that would make this uncomfortable. Daniel nodded once more. Also agreed. Emily hesitated briefly before adding the final point. And you tell me exactly what story we are supposed to follow so I do not accidentally embarrass you in front of your family. Daniel allowed himself a small amused smile. That is probably the most important rule of all. Emily shook her head lightly, still half surprised at herself for even considering it. So what exactly is our story? Daniel shifted slightly in his chair and leaned closer, so their conversation remained private, while the rest of the guests focused on the wedding speeches beginning at the front of the room. The simplest explanation will work best, he said quietly. We were married last year in a small private ceremony. You prefer staying out of the public spotlight, which explains why most people here have never met you before. Emily raised one eyebrow. You have thought about this before. Only as a hypothetical solution, Daniel admitted. I did not expect to find someone willing to help. She laughed softly under her breath. I have not said yes yet. Daniel nodded toward the front of the hall, where several elegantly dressed guests were beginning to look around the room. You might want to decide soon. Emily followed his gaze and noticed a tall woman in a silver dress scanning the tables with clear purpose. Even from across the room, the woman carried an air of confidence that made people step slightly aside as she walked. Emily looked back at Daniel. Let me guess, she said quietly. That is the person you were worried about. Daniel did not turn his head, but his calm expression confirmed everything. Yes. Emily took a slow breath and glanced once more around the room, filled with strangers celebrating someone else's perfect day. Her normal life rarely included unexpected choices like this. It was usually work, school drop-offs, grocery shopping, and bedtime stories for Lily. But tonight felt different, almost like stepping briefly into a story that did not belong to her. She looked back at Daniel and extended her hand slightly across the table. All right, she said quietly. For the next few hours, I suppose I am your wife. Daniel looked at her hand for a second before gently shaking it, a grateful smile appearing for the first time since he had sat down. Thank you, Emily, he said softly. Then he added in a calm voice, You may want to stand up now. Emily frowned slightly. Why? Daniel glanced toward the approaching woman across the room. Because my family is about to arrive. Emily felt her heart beat a little faster as she pushed her chair back and stood beside Daniel. For a brief second, she wondered if she had just made the most unusual decision of her life, but there was no time left to reconsider. The tall woman in the silver dress was already moving confidently through the tables, and two older guests followed a few steps behind her. Daniel stood smoothly beside Emily, his calm presence returning as if this moment had always been part of his plan. Without drawing too much attention, he gently placed his hand near the middle of her back, a simple gesture that felt surprisingly natural and also very convincing to anyone watching. Emily straightened her shoulders slightly and reminded herself of the small story they had agreed on only moments earlier. Married last year. Private ceremony. Prefer staying out of the spotlight. It was simple enough to remember, yet she still felt the strange thrill of stepping into a role she had never imagined playing. The woman in silver finally reached their table and stopped a few feet away. Up close, she looked even more polished than Emily had expected, with perfectly styled blonde hair and the confident expression of someone who was used to controlling every room she entered. Her eyes moved immediately to Daniel. There you are, she said smoothly. I was beginning to think you skipped the reception entirely. Daniel offered a polite but calm smile. Good evening, Victoria. The woman's attention shifted slowly toward Emily, and for a moment her expression revealed a hint of surprise that quickly disappeared behind a practiced smile. And who might this be? She asked. Emily felt Daniel's hand remain steady at her back as he spoke. Victoria, this is my wife, Emily. The word hung in the air between them, and Emily forced herself to keep her expression relaxed even though the moment still felt slightly unreal. Victoria blinked once, clearly not expecting that introduction. Your wife? She repeated with a light laugh that sounded polite, but carried a trace of disbelief. Daniel nodded calmly. Emily Carter Whitmore. Emily gave a small friendly smile and extended her hand. It is nice to meet you. Victoria looked at her hand for a brief moment before shaking it lightly. Her grip was firm but brief, and her sharp eyes quickly returned to Daniel. You never mentioned being married. Daniel's tone remained relaxed. It happened last year. We kept the ceremony small. Victoria folded her arms gently, as if considering this new information. How convenient that no one in the family seems to know about it. Emily could feel the tension rising beneath the surface of the conversation, but Daniel did not appear the least bit uncomfortable. Instead, he looked at Emily briefly with a warm expression that almost felt genuine. Emily prefers a quiet life, he said calmly. She is not particularly fond of large social gatherings. Emily nodded slightly, playing along with the explanation. I am still getting used to them, she added softly. Victoria studied her carefully from head to toe, clearly evaluating every detail. For a moment the room felt quieter to Emily, even though the wedding music continued playing behind them. Finally Victoria smiled again, though this time the smile felt more calculated. Well, Emily, she said smoothly. Welcome to the family. She paused for a moment before adding, I am sure we will all be very interested to learn more about you. Emily returned the polite smile, while keeping her voice steady. I look forward to that. Victoria's gaze lingered for another second before she stepped aside to allow the two older guests behind her to approach the table. As they walked closer, Emily leaned slightly toward Daniel and whispered quietly, without moving her lips too much. Please tell me that was the hardest part. Daniel gave a small calm smile. Without looking at her. That was only the introduction. The two older guests who had followed Victoria stepped closer with warm curiosity that felt far less intimidating than the sharp attention Victoria had shown only seconds earlier. The older woman wore an elegant navy dress and carried herself with calm dignity, while the man beside her had silver hair and the relaxed posture of someone used to formal gatherings. The woman smiled kindly at Daniel before turning her attention to Emily. Daniel, she said, you certainly did not mention that you were bringing your wife tonight. Daniel kept his voice smooth and respectful. Mother, this is Emily. The word mother made Emily realize instantly that the woman standing in front of her was not just another curious guest. She was Daniel's mother. Emily offered a polite smile and extended her hand again. It is very nice to meet you. Daniel's mother accepted the handshake warmly. I am Margaret Whitmore, she said. And this is my husband, Robert. Robert Whitmore nodded with an easy smile. Any woman who can convince my son to attend a wedding reception already has my respect. Emily laughed softly, the comment easing a little of the tension that had been building inside her chest. I am glad I could help. Margaret studied Emily for a moment with thoughtful eyes, though her expression carried none of the suspicion Victoria had shown. Daniel has always been very private about his personal life, she said gently. So I hope you will forgive our curiosity. Emily nodded calmly, remembering the story she was supposed to follow. Of course. I understand completely. Victoria, who had remained standing nearby, watched the interaction carefully with folded arms. Her polite smile had returned, but Emily could sense that the woman was still analyzing every word and movement. Daniel seemed aware of it as well, because he gently guided Emily to sit beside him again while his parents took the remaining chairs at the table. As the four of them settled down, the wedding speeches continued at the front of the reception hall. Guests clinked glasses occasionally, while the warm glow of the lights reflected off the crystal decorations. For a moment the conversation remained light and friendly. Margaret asked where Emily and Daniel had met, and Emily repeated the simple explanation Daniel had suggested earlier. We met through mutual friends last year, she said. The ceremony was small because we both prefer quiet celebrations. Margaret smiled approvingly. That sounds very sensible. Robert leaned back slightly in his chair. And what do you do, Emily? The question caught her slightly off guard, but she answered honestly. I work at a community clinic as an administrative assistant. Robert nodded thoughtfully. That sounds like important work. Emily appreciated the kindness in his voice. Many people at events like this usually lost interest the moment they realized she did not have a glamorous career. Before she could say anything else, Margaret asked another gentle question. Do you enjoy living in the city? Emily smiled faintly. I do. It keeps life busy. Daniel glanced at her briefly, noticing the careful way she chose her words while staying close enough to the truth that she did not feel uncomfortable. Then Margaret asked one more question, her tone still warm but slightly curious. And what do you like to do when you are not working? Emily hesitated for the briefest moment before answering. Most of my time is spent with my daughter. The words slipped out naturally before she could consider how they might complicate the story. The table grew quiet for half a second as Margaret's eyebrows lifted with gentle surprise. You have a daughter? She asked kindly. Emily nodded. Her name is Lily. She is 6 years old. Daniel turned his head toward Emily with clear surprise in his eyes, because this was the first detail she had not mentioned during their quick plan earlier. But instead of reacting with confusion, he simply gave a calm, thoughtful nod, as if the information made perfect sense. Margaret's smile widened warmly. "Well, that explains why Daniel never mentioned you," she said lightly. "He probably wanted to keep such a special part of his life private." Victoria, however, did not smile at all. Victoria's expression remained perfectly composed, but the silence that followed Emily's words felt sharper than before. She tilted her head slightly, studying Emily with renewed interest as if the mention of a child had introduced an entirely new puzzle. "A daughter," Victoria repeated slowly, her tone polite, yet carefully measured. "That is interesting." Emily kept her posture relaxed, even though she could feel Daniel glance briefly toward her. The wedding music continued softly in the background, and somewhere across the room guests began applauding another speech, but at their table the air felt unusually focused. Margaret, however, reacted very differently from Victoria. Her face brightened with genuine warmth. 6 years old is a wonderful age, she said kindly. Children at that age are full of curiosity. Emily nodded with a small smile that came naturally the moment Lily's name entered the conversation. She definitely is, Emily replied. She asks about everything. Robert chuckled lightly. That sounds like most 6-year-olds. Victoria finally pulled out the empty chair beside Margaret and sat down gracefully, though her attention never drifted far from Emily. And Daniel never thought to mention that he had become a stepfather, she said smoothly. Daniel rested his hand lightly on the table, as if the question had been expected. Emily and Lily have been my priority, he answered calmly. I prefer keeping family matters private. Victoria gave a small, thoughtful nod, as if considering the explanation. Of course, she said, though something in her tone suggested she was not completely convinced. Before she could continue, the master of ceremonies at the front of the reception hall spoke into the microphone, asking everyone to direct their attention to the stage for a brief announcement. The room slowly quieted as guests turned toward the dance floor where the bride and groom stood smiling beneath the warm lights. Emily felt a small wave of relief at the temporary distraction. Daniel leaned slightly closer to her while everyone watched the stage. His voice remained low enough that only she could hear. You handled that well, he said quietly. Emily kept her eyes forward so it did not look like they were whispering. I did not plan to mention Lily, she replied softly. It just felt strange pretending she does not exist. Daniel nodded once, his expression thoughtful rather than concerned. You do not need to hide that part of your life. Emily glanced at him briefly, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. Before she could respond, applause broke out again across the hall as the announcement ended and the band began playing a lively song. Guests returned to their conversations while servers began delivering the first dinner plates. At the table, Margaret continued speaking cheerfully about children and family traditions, clearly fascinated by the idea that Daniel might now have a young child in his life. Robert listened with an amused smile while sipping his drink. Victoria, however, remained quiet, observing every detail. As one of the servers placed dinner plates in front of the guests, another man approached the table from the side of the room. He wore a dark suit and carried himself with the confident stride of someone used to addressing important people. When he reached Daniel, his face lit up with recognition. Daniel Whitmore, the man said with enthusiasm. I thought that was you. Emily turned slightly in her chair, and the man's next words made her heart pause for a brief second. I did not expect the chief executive officer of Whitmore Technologies to attend a small wedding like this. The table fell silent, and Emily slowly turned her head toward Daniel. For a brief moment, Emily wondered if she had misunderstood what the man had just said, but the respectful tone in his voice made it clear that this was not a joke. The chief executive officer of Whitmore Technologies. The words seemed to echo quietly in her mind, while the table remained completely silent. Emily slowly turned her head toward Daniel, studying his calm expression as if she were seeing him for the first time. Daniel Whitmore did not look embarrassed or surprised by the recognition. Instead, he offered the man a polite handshake. Good evening, Thomas, he said evenly. I did not realize you would be attending tonight. The man laughed warmly. The groom is my nephew, Thomas explained. But I must admit I did not expect to see you here either. His attention shifted toward Emily with friendly curiosity. And you must be Mrs. Whitmore. Emily felt a small wave of uncertainty pass through her chest, but Daniel's steady presence beside her helped her keep her composure. She offered a polite smile and nodded slightly. It is nice to meet you. Thomas smiled approvingly before excusing himself to greet other guests. As he walked away, the quiet tension at the table slowly returned. Emily kept her eyes on Daniel for a moment longer, realizing that the stranger who had casually asked her to pretend to be his wife was not simply a well-dressed guest trying to avoid an awkward conversation. He was the leader of a major technology company. The realization made the entire situation feel even more surreal. Victoria was the first to break the silence. She leaned back slightly in her chair and gave a slow knowing smile. "Well," she said smoothly, "that certainly explains a few things." Margaret looked mildly surprised, but not shocked. "Daniel rarely discusses his work at family gatherings," she said gently, glancing toward Emily as if trying to reassure her. Robert chuckled quietly. "He prefers quieter conversations." Emily forced a small calm smile, though inside her thoughts were racing. She remembered the moment only an hour earlier when Daniel had sat down beside her at the forgotten table near the window and asked her to pretend to be his wife for the evening. At the time she had imagined he might be a lawyer, an investor, or perhaps someone from a wealthy family. But a chief executive officer of a large technology company was something entirely different. Victoria watched Emily carefully, clearly enjoying the moment. "It must be exciting," she said sweetly, "to suddenly discover you married one of the most successful executives in the city." Emily met her gaze calmly, even though the comment carried a clear edge of sarcasm. "Tonight has certainly been full of surprises," she replied politely. Daniel turned slightly toward Victoria, his voice still calm, but noticeably firmer. "Emily does not measure people by their job titles." Victoria lifted her glass slowly and gave a light laugh. "Of course she does not." The band began playing another upbeat song while guests nearby stood up and walked toward the dance floor. The reception hall filled again with cheerful voices and clinking glasses, but at their table the conversation had taken on a very different tone. Victoria leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing with quiet confidence. "Tell me something, Emily," she said smoothly. "If you and Daniel were married last year, how is it that no one in his family has ever seen a single photograph of your wedding?" The question hung in the air like a spotlight. Margaret glanced at Daniel with curiosity while Robert leaned back in his chair, watching the exchange with calm interest. Emily felt every pair of eyes at the table shift toward her as Victoria's smile widened just enough to reveal that she believed the entire story was about to fall apart. For a brief second the entire table remained silent as Victoria's question settled into the air. Emily felt the weight of every gaze turning toward her, yet instead of panic, she felt an unexpected calm. Perhaps it was because the evening had already become so strange that another challenge no longer felt frightening. She folded her hands gently on the table and met Victoria's confident smile without hesitation. "That is actually very simple," Emily said softly. Victoria raised one eyebrow, clearly expecting the explanation to collapse. But before Emily could continue, Daniel calmly set his glass down and spoke. "Because the ceremony was private," he said evenly. Victoria gave a light laugh. "Private ceremonies usually still involve photographs." Daniel turned slightly toward her, his expression steady. "Emily asked me not to turn one of the most important days of our lives into something shared publicly." Margaret nodded slowly, clearly appreciating the thought. "That sounds very respectful," she said. Victoria leaned back in her chair, still unconvinced. "And there is not even a single photo saved on a phone." Emily smiled gently at the question. "There are photos," she said, "but they are at home." Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly, as if she were calculating the answer. "Convenient." Daniel's voice became just a little firmer, though still calm. "Victoria." The single word was enough to quiet the tone of the conversation. He rested his arm casually along the back of Emily's chair in a gesture that looked completely natural to anyone watching. "I understand your curiosity," he continued evenly. "But Emily does not enjoy being placed in uncomfortable situations." Margaret nodded again with quiet approval. Robert gave a small amused smile as he watched the exchange unfold. For a moment Victoria seemed ready to challenge the story again, but the surrounding noise of the reception began to swell as the band announced the first dance for the guests. Couples stood up from their tables while laughter and music filled the hall. Daniel glanced toward the dance floor and then looked back at Emily. "Would you like to dance?" he asked calmly. Emily blinked slightly at the sudden change of direction. The idea of dancing in the middle of this complicated situation felt almost absurd, yet she could sense that Daniel was offering a graceful way to end the conversation. She gave a small nod. All right. Daniel stood and offered his hand. As Emily placed her hand in his, she could feel Victoria watching closely from the table, but she chose not to look back. Instead, she allowed Daniel to guide her toward the dance floor, where several other couples had already gathered. Under the warm lights, the music was slow and elegant, and for a moment the entire room seemed softer than before. Daniel placed one hand gently at Emily's side while they moved carefully with the rhythm of the song. Emily glanced up at him with a quiet mixture of curiosity and disbelief. You never mentioned being the chief executive officer of a technology company, she said softly. Daniel gave a small, thoughtful smile. You never asked. Emily shook her head slightly, still amazed by how quickly the evening had changed. You realize this started as a favor between two strangers. Daniel looked down at her with calm sincerity. Sometimes the most important people in our lives begin as strangers. Emily did not immediately respond. She simply followed the rhythm of the music while the lights of the reception hall reflected softly across the floor. Somewhere behind them, Victoria remained seated at the table, still watching carefully. But for the moment the tension had faded into the background. And for the first time that evening, Emily felt that the unexpected story she had stepped into might not end when the music stopped.